Welcome to the Bearded Bereans, where we analyze topics of the day in the light of the scriptures. I'm Jason Bolt. I'm here with Cole Strawn. We are the Bearded Bereans. This is episode 3 of season 1. And for this season, the topic that we are exploring or analyzing in the light of the scriptures is Christian education. And we're using C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man as kind of our blueprint or our map, maybe, if you will, as we explore this topic and work our way through it. And we are right in the middle of chapter 1, titled Men Without Chests. We worked our way through a little bit of it last time, and we'll pick up where we left off. But before we do, Cole, what do you have with you today?
I was going to show you the label, but I just destroyed it and taking it off. It's a Covenant cigar.
Oh.
Yeah. So this thing has been redeemed, and as long as it obeys the covenant, it has nothing to worry about.
Were its parents believers?
I believe so. Yeah. This isn't one of those pesky Baptist Covenant cigars. This is
good,
full-on Presbyterian cigar. So
very good.
Yeah. What about you? What do you got?
You don't want to know what I have.
You're going to make me very jealous, right?
I am.
You're not responsible for my emotional state. Go ahead.
It's the 1926.
Of course it is.
Yeah. I also found this in the bottom of my humidor earlier today.
Again, delightful. First you had the Damaso. Now you have... Just go ahead and light it up.
It is rough.
It must be. Maybe one day I'll be able to be a school principal, a headmaster, and be able to afford all the good stuff.
Yep.
You're clearly paid big bucks.
Yep. That's exactly the scenario.
Yeah.
All right. Well, do you remember how far we got last time, Cole?
Not very. We made it, I think, through page 1 of the book. But we did set out quite a few concepts and made our way to the point where we started discussing sentimentality in its role, maybe put forth some questions. But as far as where we've been, our big discussion last week was the discussion of the public school and its role in the demise of our society. But how did we get to that point? And so we discovered a book written by who's called Gaius and Titius, and C.S. Lewis is critiquing them and their view on objective truth and really subjectivism, and their sinister way of inserting subjectivism into the minds of their pupils. And so as we move off from this point, it's going to be very interesting to see and connect this to today, and I'm looking forward to that. But one of the things that Lewis says, the very power of Gaius and Titus, is that the schoolboy, the high school child, the pupil, though he was thinking that he was doing his English prep, he had no notion that ethics, theology, politics, all of those things are at stake. And that's generally education. The kids are learning all these facts. They're learning all these figures. They're learning this worldview, but they don't understand what's at stake. They don't see the bigger picture yet. And so they're incredibly impressionable. And like we discussed last week, they can hear an assumption and start basing how they think through that assumption without ever analyzing that assumption. So, it's
Yep.
Devastating.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's about where we got to last week. Is that the writers of this textbook have been putting forward this idea, um, in a, I would say, almost nefarious way, pushing subjectivism, but not, as we'll see as we go further in the essay, they're not actually pushing subjectivism. They're just seeking to get rid of the traditional worldview so that they can then replace it with their own. Uh, but I think today we'll start to get into a little bit about what starts to happen to the schoolboy, when he's placed in that presupposed subjective world, the things that start to happen to him within the educational context.
Which you clearly have a lot of experience with that, dealing with students, and you see the effects that certain curricula has. Man, plural English is difficult. You see the effects that these things have on children, and so not only are we going to be speaking from the books, but obviously your enormous experience in that area. I hope
Yeah,
you
it's
bring to
been
bear.
devastating. The last 80 years of public so-called education, um, it's been devastating on our youth who are now grown up and adults and have raised their own kids, and it's been devastating on them, and that's happened several times over.
Yeah, yeah, and it just snowballs. It gets worse and worse every decade as the society gone over the precipice.
Yes.
And so, what that brings up a question: what is the utility of seeing what has happened? Like, why are we doing this? If all this is taking place already, we're learning from someone who wrote 80 years ago. The enormous giant snowball has turned into an avalanche, and there's no stopping it. What's the utility in thinking through these things now?
So I grew up in Montana. I spent a lot of time in the mountains. And one of the first things that I learned as a kid, and this was just like every kid knew this growing up, is you get lost in the mountains. The first thing you do is you figure out where you're at. Don't worry about where you need to go yet or any of those things. The first thing, figure out where you're at. And you've got to know where you are in order to figure out how to get out.
Mm.
And a lot of times, in order to figure out where we are, we have to look at how we got here. Because it's not as though it's happened overnight. It's happened over the course of, well, 80 years since Lewis gave these series of lectures that became the abolition of man. And so looking at the things that he was observing and the things that he predicted and sort of step by step how they worked, that shows us sort of step by step how we've gotten to here, which tells us where we are, which then helps us hopefully figure out how to get out of here.
Yeah, and to get out of here, we shall, I think, by God's grace. So, going back to the book, we have two objectives really that are put forth. And it seems like, and I want to set forth a little bit of what Lewis says directly from the book. He says that they misunderstand the needs of the time in education right now. They see the world around them as swayed by emotional propaganda, and they see children as sentimental, and they learn this from tradition. And so, what they're setting out to do is to rob them of sentimentality, fortify their minds against emotions that are appropriate to what they want to be the outcome. Whereas Lewis, he has a different way of handling this. So he really sees education completely differently. He sees the problem completely differently than Gaius and Titius does. And this beautiful quote comes from him. He says, "The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts." And so I know you have plenty to say about this because of your role in education now, but could you kind of color that in for us, fill that in a little bit?
Yeah, well, I'd love to. So he's arguing against what the writers of this textbook are trying to do, which is they're trying to almost protect the student from being emotionally influenced from outside stimuli. And they refer to it as propaganda or whatever it might be. And so they're trying to essentially protect the student from anything that might cause him to have certain sentiments or have some emotional experience or something that they don't want him to have. And so the way that they do that is by creating this chasm between the student and the world. And we talked about the waterfall last time, and we used the example of sunsets and sunrises and these beautiful things, and how the writers of this textbook are attempting, without arguing for it, but they're just assuming it, but they're attempting to create this world in which the waterfall doesn't actually have any value in and of itself. It doesn't merit anything from the observer. The observer just has an emotion when he sees it, but it's not connected to the waterfall at all. So there's this space that's invented, that's created between the student and the object, or the student and really the rest of the world, which includes all the objects in the world. It includes all of the people in the world, his neighbor, his siblings, his parents. And so what ends up happening is the student becomes isolated from everything around him. And part of what it means to be human is to have proper emotional responses to the things around you in the world. A proper emotional response to your neighbor, a proper emotional response to your parents, a proper emotional response to the sunset. That's part of what it means to be human. And so when we create that separation to where I no longer have any response to the things around me, then in Lewis's mind, I dry up like a desert because I'm alone and isolated. I'm like the Dead Sea, right? There's nothing coming in, there's nothing going out, and I'm just salty and dead. And so when he talks about the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, meaning it's not to stop these kids from experiencing emotion, but rather it's to irrigate deserts, meaning these kids are withering on the vine in terms of what it means to be human. Like they have no idea what it actually means to be human and how to interact with the world around them in a meaningful, valuable sort of way. And so the task of the modern educator is to irrigate those deserts and to help them develop that relationship with the world around them. It goes back to Van Til's definition of education. Education is the process of orienting the student to God and the world that God has created. And part of that orientation is learning what my relationship is to all of these things and what a proper relationship looks like. And a proper relationship, when I see an incredible sunrise, is one of awe and humility, like you mentioned last time. But when we create that gap between the sunset and the student, we lose that proper relationship. And in a sense, we lose a lot of what it means to be human.
Yeah, he says that the only defense that you have against false sentiment is to inculcate true sentiment. It's like chiseling out the soul of a student if you go Gaius and Titius's route. There's a really interesting quote that that comes shortly after. Let's see here. Yeah, another little portion of human heritage is taken away quietly from them before they're old enough to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the tragedy of this whole thing is we're dealing with kids. I mean, kindergartners, first grade, all the way into high school, we're dealing with children. Some of them more mature than others, but they don't even realize what's happening to them.
Mm.
It's just being done quietly behind the scenes. Not behind the scenes, but certainly quietly, covertly. You know, and I don't want to cut off your thought, but as you were talking, and you're talking about the objective of the writers of these textbook, and then the objectives that Lewis would have, and that I would hope Christian educators would have, is both of us are attempting to mold the child
Yes.
into something,
Yep.
right? Like that's the point of education. And I think we hit on this a little bit last time, but I think it's really important to mention it again that education does mold the kid. It
Hmm.
molds him into a particular image. And these textbook writers that Lewis is dealing with and the schools that we deal with today, government run schools that we deal with today, when they pretend like they're just teaching math or just teaching history or whatever it is, they're using those things as a tool to mold the kid into some image other than the image of Christ. And so
Mm.
that's one of the things I want to keep hitting on is that uh, education molds the child. And the question is, into what image are we molding him?
Yeah, and I think over the last 70 years, maybe that was a little bit more difficult for people to see. Maybe it was a little bit, like you say, it was done quietly. But think about the last 10 years. Think about the last 4 years in what we're seeing in our culture, in our society. It's clearly the effects of education.
Yep.
These children have been molded into what they are. And so you have this proliferation of pink haired, wild eyed crazies, right? That question the very, some of the very basic things about themselves. One is, am I a boy or a girl? Am I human or am I a cat? These are things where they have been oriented to a specific worldview, and it's caused all kinds of havoc in their soul, resulting in even physical destruction of their bodies. And so we have, it's no longer quietly done today. It's very overt.
Yes.
Um, and this is why you see parents going to school board meetings and raising all kinds of havoc over, and I was going to say hell. No, they are raising hell, rightfully so, about what's going on in the school, books that are being read in the library, assignments teachers are giving them. It is a full on, full court press, um, and that's a defensive term, so that doesn't even really work, right? This is fully offensive, um,
Yes.
what they're doing, and it is, as you say, kids that are being caught up in the middle of it, and there's nothing more soul wrenching for anybody to look on and see this. So,
Yeah, it's a bit of a tangent, but I think that's okay. Um, is one of the things, and you mentioned this already, is we want to look at how this impacts us today, and it's a great example. I mean, I mentioned just a few minutes ago that these kids, these students get isolated from the world around them, and they become these dry deserts, and they lose part of what it means to be human. And then you made the comment about kids not even knowing if they're human and maybe thinking that they're cats. Well, there's the logical connection, right? When we
mhm,
lose part of what it means to be a human being created in the image of God, it's
yes,
not a big step to think maybe I'm a cat and I
yep,
wasn't created in the image of God. I mean, it
yeah,
sounds insane, and it is insane, but there's a reason why kids are using litter boxes at schools.
mhm,
They just wake up one morning and think, "Well, I think I'm going to be a cat today." The
yeah.
seeds and the track for this has been planted and laid for generations going back.
Yeah, and we'll go a little bit further down this trail. Um, Anybody can look at statistics and see what it is that's happening on an emotional level to these kids. Depression's up, suicide's up, chemical dependency up, drug usage up. There are statistics like these off the chart that all
Yeah.
signify the same thing, and that is a refusal to see oneself rightly. And it's mind blowing because what they'll do is they'll say, now, because you're not accepting their gender that they are saying they are, you're causing them violence and harm, and they're going to end up committing suicide. Well, it needs to be turned back on them. It's no, it's because you're not telling them who they are, right? Like you are um, taking away any meaning from them at all.
Yep.
Your worldview is nothing more than us being chemicals fizzing and just fizzing differently than each other. And so you've taken all meaning, all purpose, all goodness out of the equation. And now we are treating people as bags of chemicals, and you are shocked when they start behaving like bags of chemicals. It's like, what do you expect? And at some level, I think they do expect these things. Makes a population easier to control when everybody's doped up on chemicals. Um, but the Christian worldview, the scriptures, any condemnation that comes from those things is dealt with at the cross, and that's the answer to all of these issues. But we don't want to go there as a society. What we would rather do is go to a bottle, which is exactly what they want you to do. They don't want you to be a free human. um, Again, that's a rabbit trail. We went down that pretty far, but it's
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 okay. I
all
mean, it
relevant.
connects to where Lewis is going in the end, and we'll get
Hmm.
there in the not too distant future. Um, so it's not too much of a rabbit trail. But I think again, the where we have gone wrong is, and we'll talk more about this when we get into different types of Christian education, and we'll talk about classical education and um, what I would refer to as a common or traditional Christian school. Um, so we'll get into this more then. But let me just say right now that one of the things that we've done wrongly, or one of the mistakes that we've made as Christians in the realm of education, is assuming that education is only about physics and history and learning English and maybe doing some art and another elective, and that's it. And so we've tried to wrestle it back from the government, we're still just teaching physics or English or whatever, not realizing that we need to be orienting the student to God and the world that he has created. And instead we're just teaching him 2 + 2 = 4, not teaching him why 2 + 2 = 4, which is really the whole point. Like, who cares what 2 + 2 equals? I mean, yeah, if you're building a bridge, yes, you need to know what 2 + 2 equals, but that's easy enough. What's way more important than that is why. Why is it that it equals 4 and not 5?
Right.
Why is it that gravity is the equation that it is? Why does light move at the speed that it does? That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And we've lost that as Christians. We've compartmentalized everything. And so, religion, which we don't even like to use the term religion anymore, but our spiritual life kind of belongs over here, and physics and math, they kind of belong over here. Um, and
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 so
and the best that some will do is they'll teach those things and sprinkle a little bit of Jesus on
yeah.
it,
Yep.
which is
Yep.
not helpful.
Yep. We'll open with prayer and, maybe have a Bible verse here and there. Um, but what we end up doing when we take that approach, and I'm not saying every Christian school does this, there's some fantastic Christian schools out there. But when we take that approach, what we do is we take what the public schools are doing and we just try to do what the government schools do, but without all the nonsense that they have. But that's not education.
Right.
Education is taking the kid and orienting him to God and the world that God has created. Um, and so we end up stunting the kid's growth at best when we take that approach. He's going to learn that 2 + 2 = 4. He's not going to know why. And honestly, if he never knows why 2 + 2 = 4, who cares if he builds a bridge using good math and physics? Who cares?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it makes no difference. What makes a difference and what actually has value and meaning is why those things are true. Because those things, of course, lead us to the creator of those things, where all value, where all meaning is located, and from which all things derive their value and their meaning. And when we don't have him, we lose the meaning of everything.
Yeah, and Lewis points this out. He says, until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. They believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. And so Lewis is really defining or setting up the stage to uh, discuss something that is really important. And we've been hitting around this all the time because we're talking about God's world. We're talking about how he created it. So what is Lewis getting at here? What is he doing here?
Well, he's starting to introduce this concept of this objective standard that all men forever essentially have accepted as governing all of mankind's interactions, his behaviors, and maybe you call it natural law, maybe you can call it the Tao in the Chinese tradition. He kind of goes through and he lists off all these different traditions and what they call it. But the argument that he's making is that when you attend a funeral, there's a certain emotion, there's a certain kind of behavior that the occasion merits from you. And it's not subjective, it's the way it is. When you observe a beautiful piece of art, that art it's not just proper for you to express, wow, that's really beautiful, but the piece itself actually merits from the observer that response. And when I talk about these things, my mind automatically goes to God because all things derive from him. And in our worship of God, it's not as though it's just proper for us to ascribe value to him. It's not only proper for us to for praise to issue forth from us, but he actually merits that praise from us, which is why then it's proper for us to do it. And so it is that way with him, and it is that way with his creation. He's created things with inherent value, with inherent meaning, because he's made them. He doesn't do anything without value or meaning. So if he's done it, if he's made it, it has value and it has meaning. And so the sunset or the waterfall then actually merits from us a certain response. And it merits from everyone that response, not just whoever happens to feel it. And so there is this objective standard that's out there that he ends up calling the Tao. There's several different terms that you could use for it. But he makes he doesn't really make the case. He just sort of says this is the way it's been. And I think he's correct that for thousands of years, all teachers have always taught from within this mindset, from within this worldview, that there is an objective standard that tells us what sort of sentiments we're supposed to have in relation to the world around us, what sorts of emotional responses we're to have.
Yeah, and I think he's making the point, and I think this is why he chooses Tao rather than natural law, is he's really showing a sense of camaraderie with these other religions. It's been defined by evangelicals all the time that religion is God or man's way to get to God, and Christianity is God's way to come to man. Now, I reject that to some level. You know, Christianity is a religion. It's the true religion,
Right.
where God is.
Yes.
So that's why I reject that. But all these other religions are still trying to deal with God's world and what he's created, and they're still trying to reason their way to him. They mess up, but they're all subject to this same way of thinking. And until 80 years ago, until 15 minutes ago in history, everybody thought this way
Mm-hmm.
because that's the way God made us to think. That That's what natural law is. And so when we talk about the Tao, and why we are subject to it, these appropriate responses and inappropriate responses, I want to look at modern culture and see how in the world in 80 years did we go from this one understanding to another, where whenever you say something like that mountain merits a specific response from you, and your response could be incongruous, it could be wrong, it could be whatever. With that, it's mind blowing to the kids. It's like, I can't understand that, because I've been taught this whole time that whatever I feel about the thing must be right, because it's how I feel, and that's the standard. And so everything else could either be congruous or incongruous with it.
Yeah, it's postmodernism is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Lewis certainly doesn't use that terminology, but that's precisely what he's describing, and that's what you're describing right now. Where let's just take literature for example. We can look at the change that has happened in literature, where you can ask yourself, where is the meaning of a particular text located? Or maybe a better question would be, where's the origin of the meaning located? And there's sort of three ways that you can look at it. You have the author of the text, you have the text itself, and you have the reader of the text. And forever, until 15 minutes ago, everybody understood that the author of the text is the entity who gave the text its meaning. Right? He's the one creating it. So if it has meaning, it's because he gave it to the text. So that's one way to view it. And then as time has gone on, you hear phrases like, a living document, right? So sort of the text begins to have its own sort of meaning to it, and it could have a meaning that the author maybe didn't ever intend for it to have. And we've heard that. You can think about it in terms of constitutional interpretations in the Supreme Court, things of that nature. But then there's another step that has happened in our society, which is that now you have the reader of the text looking at the text, and he's actually the one bringing the meaning with him. And so now, and I had this experience in school, in high school, and it happens all over. It happens in movies and books and
Bible
everything
studies.
else. Bible studies, okay?
Yes.
Well, good. Let's go to the Bible study. How many times have you been to a Bible study and you read the verse and they say, okay, what does this verse mean to you?
Yeah.
Right? Because the meaning is with you.
Right.
The text doesn't have meaning. The author didn't give it meaning. You do. And so if that's the case, then it's not possible for your interpretation of the text to be incorrect.
Right.
Because it is whatever you say it is.
Yeah. So rabbit trail here. This also leads to an anti-scholasticism position in the church. You have all these people that don't like to listen or look or read theology. It's all about, it's just me and a Bible under a tree, and it's basically whatever I think is what it means. And they don't want to be told that they're wrong because they've been discipled this way for years and years and years. And so what we have to recognize is that the author had intent, and this happens to be a supernatural author that has intent, and so he also intends for us to understand what he wrote, and it takes study, it takes debate, it takes all these things to determine, and obviously the Spirit leading those things, the Holy Spirit leading those things, to determine what is meant by the book. And that cannot be done by yourself or even in a Bible study where you guys are sitting around the Bible and just talking about what it means to you. That's frankly irrelevant, other than, are you in subjection to that book or are you not? Okay. All right. So this all brings up, so we talk about, in the postmodern sense, the idea of sentiment um, in certain things warranting certain responses from us is crazy talk to most people. But let's go back to Lewis. Let's go back to 80 years ago. And I'm curious, how does this relate to Gaius and Titius in the Green Book? So they've set forth some ideas that basically exclude the very possibility of sentiment being unreasonable. And we kind of touched on this already, but how does that happen? How does that happen?
Yeah, so they're critiquing another person's analysis of this piece of literature. Because one guy looks at the waterfall and says, "Oh, it's sublime." Another guy says, "Oh, it's pretty." And the person they're critiquing is saying, "No, it's not pretty. It is sublime. Like, have the right response." And what they're critiquing is, no, it's not. Yes, this is the right response, and that's the wrong response. But rather, let's get more in touch with whatever the response is that we're having. And so they don't come out and push subjectivism, but like I said before, they presuppose this subjective world where if you see it one way, that's fine. And if I see it another way, that's also fine. And just simply by making that statement, we have presupposed a world in which there is no objective standard that could possibly tell me that my sentiment or my response is incorrect.
Hmm.
They've eliminated it from the outset as not even an option that we can talk about, and they've put the locus, the place of meaning and value, they've placed it in the individual person, and whatever he feels, that is correct.
Yeah. So how does this move into Lewis saying that the Green Book uh, produces what could be called men without chests?
Yeah. So Lewis's case that he's building is that man is a particular kind of being created in the image of God who has particular traits that make him distinct from beasts. And some of those traits, certainly not all of them, but some of them are that we, number one, have emotions, and we have sentiments, that we have things like a sense of duty. We know what honor is, um, those kinds of things. As a hunter, I know I keep bringing this up as analogies, but as a hunter, right, I've shot elk before, and it falls over dead, and the one standing next to it kind of looks at it, and they all start to kind of leave, and they look back like, "Well, are you coming or not?" You know, that's not the response that you and I would have
Mhm.
if we were sitting here and one of us was shot, because we're
Right.
human. Elk or not, they're
Right.
beasts. They don't care. They, it's not even right to say that they don't care. They don't have that part to them. So part of what it means to be human is to care and have those sentiments and have emotions. And part of what it means to be operating properly as a human is to have the proper sentiments, to have the proper emotional responses. It's one thing to have emotions, it's another thing to have the proper ones. And so all humans are always going to have emotion, right? We can't get away from that. Even these kids in the desert who need the water so that they can grow and flourish, they still have emotions. They're just not behaving properly. Right? They're not operating the way that God has intended them to operate. And so in that sense, they're losing a little bit of what it means for them to be human. And very often, rather than operating out of a well-organized emotional life that is in accordance with the Tao, they end up operating out of what Lewis ends up calling instinct, or just out of their gut. Whatever just sort of gut reaction they have, that's what they do. And in a lot of ways, that's very similar to what beasts do. They just act. Um, and and Lewis makes the case that if we continue down this path, we're going to be creating men who operate without chests and who just um, behave in accordance with their instinct, with their gut reaction to things.
Yeah. So Lewis refers to the connection between visceral man and cerebral man, right? And cerebral man is the one that thinks, the one that is logical, that analyzes, that does all these things. And visceral man is the one that reacts, that is base, that is instinctual, like you said. And the chest is what rules that, right?
Yeah,
It's how the mind rules the belly. And so there's this saying that Lewis is operating off of is that the head rules the belly through the chest. That's what he's referring to. He calls it the executive officer, I believe. It might be a little bit different. But basically, that you have an XO on a ship that basically makes sure that the captain's will is being done. Um, and so we see the practical effects of this in modern times. We're 80 years down the road of the chest being eroded in men, in women too, in humans. We have lost humanity little by little. As he said, the human heritage gets cut away from the pupil quietly. It's being cut away in every generation to where there's really nothing left. And so, what do we see? Right? We see riots that are based on complete falsehoods because nobody's brain is fitting in with their gut. Right? Um, we have teachers in public school classrooms being threatened, being beat up. Like there's almost weekly, it seems like, a video coming out of a public school and a teacher being harassed in some way. Or I remember seeing one video where a student picks up a desk and just throws it at a teacher, right? Well, because his emotion is valid for him, and
right.
so you've got riots, you've got um, the crazy outburst of emotion, you got mass shooters, you know, just us good liberals, want to take away the gun, but don't realize that the very uh, functionality that would rule that gun well has been taken away first. That they've caused that problem because they've degraded the chest over generations. Where there is no valor, there is no honor, there is no duty, there's no right ordering of emotions in the chest. And so it's crazy. We talk about it every episode, seems like, and I guess we will until we're done with the book. But I think you could fairly say that Lewis saw all of this coming. Should we not move away from it? And we're really kind of in a situation now where we've got to coalesce as Christians and teach our kids rightly ordered emotions and how to rule visceral man, by cerebral man through the chest, and we will see culture blossom, I think, again in our little conclave.
Yeah, we have got to come to see education as the process of making children into mature humans. Until and unless we have that view of education, we will stumble along as a society, sort of maiming ourselves and, sort of barely existing and subsisting, inviting tyranny over us, and not living full lives as full human beings created in the image of God. But at the same time, if we do recognize that that's what education is about, and we actually start doing it in the Christian church, even just a small percentage of the overall society, um, the change that we would see is incredible, I believe.
What I think that's what the Lord is doing. I was just I was listening to another podcast before I came in here, and it's they're actually going over Christian education they're going over education and feminism's poisoning of that. It's a great episode. Theologians released, I think, recently. But it's interesting how many Christians in our circles are being turned on to this, and hopefully it's a movement of the Lord to do exactly that. We want people to wake up to their duty as parents, because it starts with the parent. And if you choose to outsource the education, you do so as a responsible member of God's kingdom, and you're going to answer for that on who you outsource it to. So that's really, I really hope that's what the Lord's doing, and we could see. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we could see some Christian culture rising from the ashes of this horrible experiment we call secularism today.
Yeah, it's a horrible experiment for sure. Let me give you a little illustration, just from my own school, that maybe illustrates what we're talking about here in terms of what the whole purpose of education is. One of the things that comes up in every small Christian school in a high school setting is always, well, what electives do you offer, right? Because kids are at that stage where they want to, maybe study some things that they have an interest in, and they're starting to realize, well, I'm not all that interested in physics or whatever, but I'd be really interested in computer coding. I'd like to do something in that. So there's always talk about, well, what sort of electives do you have? So as the administration, we're always talking about, well, we could offer this elective maybe or that one, but resources are limited in small schools. You can only have so many classes and so many teachers, so there's limits. And this is what I say whenever the question comes to me of, well, we're going to add more electives. My answer is, I don't care. I don't care what classes we offer. And I honestly don't. I don't care if we teach physics. I don't care if we teach Latin. I don't care if we teach coding. I don't care. It makes no difference to me, because those things are all tools that we are using to orient the kid to God and the world he has created. So of course, we teach music, and I think Latin is important, and I want everyone to take music because like some of these tools are really good tools, but it's not the tool that we want them to, that we're focused on, right? It's the result of the tool that I'm interested in. And so I don't care what electives we offer. Whatever elective that we offer, we're going to use it to shape the kid into the image of Christ.
Yeah, I think that perspective, your perspective, is right on. I think the parent sometimes misses the forest for the trees. Um, and we talk about having the root of the matter in various areas of theology, and I think this is really kind of the important thing. Imagine caring about whether your child he wants to weld, and so you want to find a school that teaches him to weld. He's at high school or whatever, but he's never gotten the worldview down. He hasn't been educated. He hasn't been oriented properly to God's world, right? Imagine thinking, well, I'm going to avoid a school because they don't offer welding, and you go to some technical school, and he may be a fantastic welder, make $25 an hour starting out, and just, that's great. But what kind of a human is he going to be? Like what,
Yes.
and maybe prioritize what kind of human he's going to be. And by the time we get into high school, we can talk about those things. Maybe a school administration could say, you know what, we don't offer welding, but I'll tell you what, we have a great program here. We'd love to have them here. And we could point you to somewhere that has this program as a day program, or as as adult learning, or there's so many things that you could point people to, right? There's so many classes offered by colleges, Christian colleges even, that are electives and things of that nature. So I
There's
don't
so
want
many.
parents.
Yeah, go
Go
ahead. I
ahead.
don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Well, I just don't want parents to think, my child wants to learn underwater basket weaving and your class doesn't, your school doesn't offer it, you know, like, let's get them there, but they're not there yet.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. The vocational skills, those need to come, but not
Mm-hmm.
yet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they can, right? If it works out, that's great, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
have to come yet. And I think this is part of the movement of classical Christian education that we're seeing in our country now, which is fantastic. Is the mindset is we want to take your kid from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade for 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
We want to make him a good human being.
Mm-hmm.
So that when he graduates here, I love the way you put it. Oh, so you might have this skill, but what kind of human are you, right? And the whole goal of classical Christian education is to make good humans,
Yeah.
for them to behave in accordance with the image that they bear as human beings created in the image of God. And when we do that and we graduate them after grade 12, they're in a position where they have a biblical worldview that they're standing on, that they're rooted in, that they see the world through. Their sentiments and their emotions are properly aligned and ordered. Um, Obviously, they still have a whole lifetime of sanctification to go through, but they have the building blocks there, right? The first steps are in place. And from there, they can then go out and and get a marketable skill, right? They can then go get a 2-year degree in welding if they want to, and be prepared to go out and take those skills that they learn in those places and bring them into the worldview that they already have. And that's where those skills and things, that's where those things really begin to have meaning, because they can take those skills and they can go and get a job in order to help them build a family and love and care for their wife and their or their husband and their children, and build something that's lasting, of real value, that has real meaning. But you can't skip that crucial step of making the kid into a good human.
Yeah. That's the goal. Building good humans.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to start using that.
Yeah.
What kind of human are you?
Steal it. So I think we'll end with this. I want to read Deuteronomy 6:4-9. I referenced it earlier last week, but hear this and consider this and tell me, or not, don't tell me, tell yourself whether you're operating according to these principles. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you first rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be like frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on your doorpost, your house, and your gates."
Primary function of the parent is to bring the kid up into the kingdom of God.
Mm.
It's the primary function of the parent. It's not to prepare them for college. It's not to help them make sure they get a good job. You know, sure, help them do those things, yeah. But the primary function of the parent is to enculturate the kid into the world that God has created, living the way that God has designed him to live, in accordance with the image that he bears, being created in the image of God.
You have two options. You can do it like the world does it, or you could do it like your God has told you to do it. And so we want to help you do that. The second option, not the first.
That's why we're here.
That's why we're here. That's all I have. I have no more notes for this week.
Yeah, that gets us all the way through chapter 1. We continue this process. We end up with men without chests, and we look around us today, and that has happened. But here's the frightening thing: is that's not all that happens. Uh, Lewis has two more chapters to go in his little essay, and he's going to continue his thought experiment, looking at what comes, when we presuppose this subjective world and put the student down within it, and we slowly carve out his humanity away from him, little piece by piece, generation after generation. What happens after 20, 30, 40, 50 years? What are the things that begin to take place within our society? And he begins to talk about that. And we'll look at it, and we'll see how it has taken place in our society all around us.
I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be good.
It will be.
So we will see you guys next week. God bless.
The kings who fight against my Lord shall taste his wrath and meet his sword. Upon their corpses he will look, then drink to vengeance from abroad.
How many times do I got to push it?
Still going.